So let's take a focused look at the recently updated Space Marine core rule. Just how powerful is the core codex Oath of Moment? Now it doesn't just help your hits land accurately, but you also get a massive boost to wounds. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought it could be interesting to talk a bit more about the core Space Marine rule change, Games Workshop's eventual answer to how to make core codex Space Marines compete against their Divergent chapter peers, and it turned out to be a rather savage boost to their core rule. In the lore, the Oaths of Moment maybe aren't the most widely recognised bit of Space Marine backstory, but seems to have taken over as the core rule for them in 10th edition that all Space Marines get. These vows hail back to the Great Crusade, and they're basically pre-battle oaths sworn by battle brothers to achieve some great goal, or to honour the Emperor in some given way in the coming fight, and often displayed on the Marines' armour in parchment or purity seals. When it was first unveiled in the 10th edition previews, it made a bit of a stir, just given it was a massively impactful rule where Space Marines could reroll all hits and wounds against one given target, which maybe did seem a little bit game warping at the time. Basically, Space Marines just get ridiculous massive damage against literally anything that this rule is against, but as a result might be balanced by being a touch pillow-fisted against other things maybe. In their codex, it seems that Games Workshop kind of agreed with that assessment and decided to tone it down to just reroll hits. They're now over a year on into 10th edition, and it seems that they've restored it to much of its former glory. It's not full reroll wound rolls anymore, but still having a +1 to wound on it is going to kind of break the math on the wound roll table for a lot of units, and make a lot of more middling things very strong against punching up against tough stuff. I thought for this video we could take a look at the rule and its damage output, what it does with a few units, including some with some Oath of the Moment special rules. First up, I thought it would be interesting just to take a look at some damage numbers. And for a bit of context, these are the ones from the start of the edition, when Oath of the Moment went from re-rolling all hits and wounds to just re-rolling hit rolls. As you can see, the full hit and wound damage output was thoroughly savage. If you had a Space Marine already hitting on a 3+ and wounding on a 3+, then they're likely already at least fairly efficient against their targets. But the old style Oath would still give you a +78% damage increase, which was kind of mad, and then it got better as you were wounding on worse numbers, either on a 4+ or a 5. In theory, double damage if you were taking aim at a target you were wounding on a 4+, and then over double damage if you were wounding on a 5. It felt like a far more big deal for certain armies, really punishing the armies that needed big durable threats to survive in the open to be able to win, maybe armies like Custodians and Imperial Knights in particular. When it changed to the Codex Space Marine Oath of Moment, re-rolling all hit rolls just meant on average a 33% damage increase on the most normal Space Marine weapon skill and ballistic skill when you were hitting on a 3+, and dropping down to 17% if you were hitting on a 2+ for some reason. This really was a pretty massive change to Codex Space Marines at the time. Usually it meant that Oath of Moment was getting you less than half the extra damage than it used to, and easily less than a third in a lot of cases when you were taking aim at stuff you were wounding on a 5+. Now though, Games Workshop gave Oath of Moment an enormous buff in the balance update, one that was aimed to give a bit more of a selling point to the core codex chapters over the Divergent chapters, and the rule is that if you don't include any datasheets with the Black Templars, Blood Angels, Dark Angels, Death Watch or Space Wolf keywords, you get to add +1 to the wound roll on your Oath target as well. In general, for the maths on those similar targets where we're hitting on a 3+ and then wounding on a 3, 4 and 5, it doesn't quite give you as crazy numbers as the reroll wound rolls version, but it's not really too far off either. For a Space Marine unit hitting on a 3+ and wounding on a 3+, again a pretty massive damage boost there at a big 66% increase, going up to 77% extra damage if you're hitting on a 3 and wounding on a 4, and then essentially double damage if you're hitting on a 3 and wounding on a 5. It's not quite as powerful as the unrestricted wound rerolls, but it's still really powerful, compared with old Oath of Moment where you'd be getting usually 33% extra damage against everything. Unless you were already hitting on a 2 or wounding on a 2, then it's usually double damage at worst, going up to triple damage on a wounding on a 5+, and potentially even better if you were wounding on a 6, though in general most units weren't that efficient against targets that they were wounding on a 6 anyway. The +1 to wound modifier does have a few trade-offs compared with the rerolls as well. The rerolls had overlapped with twin linked, so it didn't really affect their weapons anywhere near as well. Though the new rule does have some overlap with some other things that give you positive wound rolls, tending to be a bit less common, but you can get them for things like the Gladius Task Force Lance Stratagem or say the Stormspeeder Thunderstrike when you're shooting vehicles. It does have a little bit of anti-synergy with lethal hits as well, given that if you do get a lethal hit you won't be getting the boosted wound roll, but it's still not so bad that the lethal hits aren't worth having. In any case, at least by the numbers, it does seem for a whole load of units out there, it's going to be a solid advantage for core Codex Space Marine chapters over the Divergent ones. Before we move on to take a look at a few more specific units and their effects with Oath of Moment, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in Warhaus, a new gaming store in Australia who's just setting up at the moment and wanting to get word out that they exist. with a shop opening in Brisbane, Australia fairly shortly. Currently their website has only recently gone live, with a plan to stock much of the Games Workshop range, building up to it gradually, but they still have plenty of things for sale, and a pretty nice, easy to navigate website, and kind of spectacularly generous discounts on Games Workshop products, while they set out to make a name of themselves. A big 23% off Games Workshop prices, which is about as high as I've seen at any discount store around the world. For shipping around Australia, they tend to do a flat rate of $10 Australian and free over 150, and they will have the vast majority of the Warhammer 40k range available to back order on request if an item isn't in stock as they build up their inventory. As mentioned, their website's live now. It'll be linked down in the video description along with their Instagram if you want to follow along with their progress. Their store's based on 599 Oxley Road, Corinda, and the store will be opening in January 2025, and it's currently getting put together now if you do want to see it as you're passing by. They've got some copies of Brutal and Cunning left at their big discount rate as well if that's of interest to anyone. In any case, thanks to them for sponsoring the video. I'll leave a link to them down in the video description. Getting back to super empowered Space Marines though, and quite apart from the actual damage output, there was one other interesting rules quirk from the Oath of Moment things that I certainly didn't realise on the first time I read through the rule. Weirdly enough, there's an odd way that you can play Codex Space Marines now, and basically take the Divergent chapter's detachment, but take none of the Divergent chapter's units, and sub them out for essentially getting the +1 to wound Oath of Moment version. The reason is that the boosted Oath of Moment rule is linked to any datasheets with the Black Templars, Blood Angels, Dark Angels, Death Watch or Space Wolf keywords, so you could still technically be running, say, a Space Wolf army for example, not take any of the actual Space Wolf datasheets and just go with generic Codex Space Marine ones, and that way you could weirdly have, say, a Champions of Rust attachment with +1 to wound Oath of Moment, or Blood Angels Liberator Assault Group with Oath of Moment, and just say focus mainly on, say, the Jump Intercessors, the Assault Intercessors and Blade Guard perhaps. Given that your army would be Blood Angels or Space Wolves and using those detachments, you'd also not be able to use any core Codex characters, so no Roboute Guilliman or anything from the Ultramarines or Salamanders datasheets. You'd literally just be taking, say, the Blood Angels or Space Wolf detachment with boosted Oath of Moment and none of their unique units. I'm really not sure if Games Workshop was intending this to be the way, but it certainly feels like it could have some interesting, slightly quirky combos on paper. I feel like in particular the Blood Angels one seems rather fearsome with the +1 to wound thrown in. They already get +2 strength and +1 attack when they're charging in, and add that to full rerolls to hit and also +1 to wound as well, means that even standard Codex Space Marine units are going to be punching up ridiculously hard, and could maybe be demolishing 2 targets per turn in pretty big style. Maybe one of them going in with Oath of Moment and then one going in with Red Rampage, the one that gives you the lethal hits and the Lance +1 to wound. Otherwise it looks like if you went Death Watch then you could have double Oath for 1 turn with the Tome of Ectoclades, which at least looks interesting with a +1 to wound thrown in. You'd have to pass up on literally all of the kill teams though, which means that the special issue ammo stratagems wouldn't be worth it. So you'd literally be playing a detachment basically with the teleport and the flex and mission tactics stratagem, so you'd be giving up quite a bit there. I feel like Champions of Rust is maybe a detachment that can do pretty well going fairly solidly on more generic Codex Space Marine units. I've seen a fair few competitive lists that used very little Space Wolf stuff. It does potentially add a lot of strength if you get one of the sagas active and are able to activate another one at some point in the game. That feels like you just have a monumentally hard-hitting and fairly tough Space Marine army with the 6+ feel no pain thing, between getting those powerful buffs and also boosted Oath. I feel like it's still going to be a very niche option that most people choose not to take advantage of, as passing up all the chapter unique units is one of their biggest selling points, but certainly feels that if you wanted to build a quirky list that does let you have both boosted Oath of Moment and your pick of the Divergent detachments, for the actual use of the Oath of Moment, it feels like usually it's going to be pretty obvious. Just literally point it at the biggest, scariest thing that you're going to want to bring down, and hopefully also align it with units that are going to get the best benefit out of those rerolls and the +1 to wound. Ideally, if possible, not stacking the buffs on things where they're not going to mean anything that already have inbuilt hit rerolls or +1 to wound or something. I feel like it's definitely not a hard and fast rule though. If there's just one enemy unit that absolutely needs to get destroyed and you're not sure if your units will be able to, then even if all your units were rerolling hits anyway, say with things like Gladiator Lancers in Iron Storm or something, or Brutalis Dreadnoughts, then still maybe just having the +1 to wound is the best thing for insurance, if it's just not going to be that meaningful in other places on the map. At least in theory land, if you have a big gun line, it could allow you to get basically a big damage boost on practically your entire army if you're all focusing one big tough thing in the open. In reality though, it can just be just as impactful on melee units as well, particularly given that a lot of melee stuff often tends to be wounding on 5s, and melee can often be super important to have the extra damage for, as it can kind of tip the balance and reach critical massive damage to actually wipe out an enemy unit, rather than say kill half of it and then get hit back hard. I feel like there's definitely some other interesting ways that you could use it as well, though. If you think that you've already got enough firepower to maybe destroy the big, scary enemy threat, you could maybe use it on a more positional fight where you don't have many things that can damage that enemy unit. Perhaps, for example, to power up a bunch of Inceptors dropping down from the sky, rerolling all hits, rerolling all the wounds with their twin links, and also +1 to wound as well. You're almost guaranteed to stack a whole bunch of damage on whatever that thing is, and maybe make your precision strike go a lot further. It could allow something like some outlying cursors or scouts or something to pretty much rip out the heart of an enemy unit that otherwise they wouldn't really have done much to as well between shooting and fighting. I feel like usually the goal would be to have the Oath of Moment target get destroyed by your army, but if it doesn't, it could actually open up some interesting options for Overwatch as well. If, say, you deal a whole bunch of damage to the Oath target, but then it's not quite dead, potentially if the enemy goes moving it around, then it means that you could pretty much get double damage from Overwatch, reroll everything that isn't a 6, and hopefully you could get really quite a lot of damage out of your next turn's worth of fire. And bonus points if you've got a unit with lethal hits from a lieutenant or something, where all those successful hits will convert into successful wounds. That could be an option if there's literally nothing that really matters to put Oath on. Maybe just declare it on a unit that's out of line of sight and likely to move into line of sight, so you've got the threat to deal a whole bunch of damage to it in the enemy turn. For actual standard damage output though, here's just a few examples of how Oath of Moment can increase the firepower or damage of a given unit. Maybe putting those percentage numbers into a bit more practical application. It does feel like Oath would have the biggest and most dramatic effect on units that we're going to be wounding on a 4 or 5+, so mid-strength firepower that's still rather scary is probably some of the most interesting stuff to use it on. It's pretty great on stuff like Power Fist as well. Here's just a 5-man squad of Hellblasters, which are pretty scary against things like standard issue Space Marines when they're just firing normally and fry lighter and medium infantry quite well, but they get rather next level when they have Oath of Moment on the go. It does help them a bit with the hit rolls against the Termagants or the Intercessors, but the +1 to wound comes into play against the other 3 targets. Even a squad of 5 of them taking something on the lines of 6 to 8 wounds off a Gladiator tank, around 2 to 10 Terminators, or 6 wounds to a Land Raider out of cover. It's a pretty massive force multiplier against the tough stuff, literally being double damage against the big tanks, and you could easily be one-rounding a Land Raider with 10 of them with a Lieutenant on the go. Not too bad for guns that tend to be a bit more efficient against heavy infantry. Maybe another good example of one that really likes the rerolls and doesn't have anything built in could be the Predator Destructor. This one's just taking the Auto Cannon and Las Cannon, so ignoring things like Storm Bolters or Hunter Killer missiles here, and it goes from just being a fairly sturdy long-range Space Marine gun turret into really quite a fearsome one. With Oath of Moment and 130 points worth of tank, you could be killing something along the lines of 3 Terminators, around about 10 wounds to a toughness 10 vehicle, or again like 6 wounds to a Land Raider. And this would be a bit more efficient with things like Storm Bolters and Hunter Killer missiles included, and you could easily have 2 of them focusing down on the same targets. With a +1 to wound, that feels really cheap for the sheer amount of damage their firepower can put out, and they go from being a little bit mediocre against the tough tanks to downright efficient against anything. Getting onto some units that have some special rules interactions with it, first up we've got the Terminators. They're not quite as dramatic as say the Sternguard Veterans, but they get a +1 to hit as well as the reroll hit rolls and the +1 to wound, so that means they're almost always hitting with everything, and the Power Fists in particular will really enjoy the +1 to wound rolls. And it does mean that Oath goes further on them than other places. For targets that Terminators wound on a 4+, in theory they get a +93% damage boost, so almost double damage there, rather than the +77 for more regular units wounding on a 4+. It's maybe not an enormous difference, and Terminators don't tend to be the best damage dealers out there compared with lots of other Space Marine things, but they still seem to be a pretty solid target for it. 5 with Power Fists in Oath of Moments do 10 wounds to a toughness 10 3+ save vehicle on average. It definitely feels like it takes them to the next level rather than sort of scraping away at it with something along the lines of 4 to 6 wounds against it, and if they shot it with a whole bunch of Storm Bolters wounding on a 5+ and a Cyclone missile launcher, there's a pretty good chance they'll be able to destroy most standard sized battle tanks there. Next up we've got Twin-Linked Weapons and Sternguard Veterans. Twin-Linked Weapons allow full wound rerolls, and Sternguard Veterans have their special rule upgraded where they get to reroll all wound rolls against the Oath of Moment target. These rules kind of have a bit of overlap whenever you're shooting against things that would be wounding on say a 4+ or a 3+. You're already wounding with most shots anyway, so there's slight diminishing returns there, but it does mean that if you're wounding things really quite badly, then the combination means that you still wound literally everything in the game most of the time. Say for example if you had some aggressive Boltstorm gauntlets that wounded on a 6 against a tank or vehicle, without either of the special rules on say a standard bolter it'd be a 17% chance to wound. With Oath of Moment that goes to a 5+, and then with Twin Linked that will be 5 out of 9 times. So 55% of your successful hits will wound the target, and you'll be hitting with most things normally. If you're wounding on a 5+ with a Power Fist type thing like aggressors in combat with Power Fists, then 3 out of every 4 hits will wound. Most of the Twin Links things tend to be kind of costed for their Twin Links rule though, and it maybe feels more like Sternguard are the most standout here, but it does mean that anything with the Twin Links rule is just extra good at taking down things that have really high toughness values like toughness 12 or even higher, as that's not really going to be much of a barrier to wounding them. Sternguard though can really take things to the next level. I'm planning to do a short video on Sternguard in melee sometime in the not too distant future, but here's the damage output of 5 Sternguard and a captain with range damage followed up by melee. In the turn that you trigger the captain's +3 attacks and devastating wounds, between the two of them 180 points worth of units that you can both shoot and fight with just do some absolutely obscene damage, killing around about 7 Terminators with average rolling, 15 standard size Space Marines, or 23 wounds to a toughness 12 3+ save vehicle, or even a big 19 wounds to a Land Raider spread over the 2 phases. They'll be able to one-shot most things in the game. Finally, and perhaps most intimidatingly, is Roboute Guilliman with new Oath of Moment. He did get a pretty chunky points increase, going up from 285 to 345, though he was considered really quite strong at 285, but with the balanced data slate he basically got 2 layered buffs on top of each other. First up, given that he doubles up on Oath of Moment, and now Oath of Moment got better, that was a massive direct buff to him. It means that you select one target for Oath of Moment, your army destroys it with Extreme Prejudice, and then you can select another one for them to go to town on after that. It just seems incredibly intimidating from gun lines to melee stuff. You could have him in command of a big Ironstorm list with a whole bunch of dangerous shooting with Vindicators and Predators and things. Make your tanks just ridiculously efficient at focusing fire on some big tough enemy unit, and then once you've killed it, just move on to the next target and get all the same buffs. Or you could have a bit more of a hybrid approach, maybe have one thing that you're going to destroy with Oath in the shooting phase, absolutely focus it with all of your army, and then move the Oath target to something that you're going to charge later in the turn. That rule definitely got so much better now that Oath has essentially kind of doubled in strength, and then on top of that, Games Workshop allowed him to do that and the Stratagem buff both at the same time, both of which were really powerful rules and often had a good draw to using one or the other, but now he can plug away with a massive amount of extra army damage, and also hand out, say, a free Armour of Contempt or Overwatch in the enemy turn, and some sort of movement or damage dealer style stratagem in yours if you want. Both of these boosts just feel fairly game changing, and he seems well worth it for the extra 60 points. I have a feeling that after boosted Oath of Moment, Guilliman's going to be in even more Ultramarines lists than he was before. Otherwise, for Oath of Moment combos, it now stacks even more damage on the things that you could do, where you hit on a 5+ with both lethal and sustained hits. The Fire Discipline option for that with the Apothecary Biologist got nerfed, but there's still combos that you can do with it for Ironstorm and Anvil if you'd like. Maybe the danger might be that you're getting into overkill against a bunch of targets though, and both of them take a bit of effort to set up. The Ironstorm one is probably easiest, but it's a 2 command point stratagem and also an enhancement at work. Though it does mean that any one Redemptor Dreadnought or Vindicator or Repulsor Executioner is probably going to leave a massive mark on their target. Otherwise, it could be relevant for Space Marine Whirlwinds as well. They don't generally tend to see all that much competitive play, but Oath of Moment already allowed an indirect fire weapon to hit 3 out of 4 times, which is far more often than most factions can get, and now having a +1 to wound on a mid-strength profile with AP 2 and 2 damage doesn't seem the worst thing in the world. Definitely feels like it's a boost to Space Marine weird indirect fire lists if you want. I wonder if we'll see any other army lists doing alternative things with, say, 3 Whirlwinds and just hammering a target with a whole bunch of boosted Oath of Moment damage when they want to. Overall, certainly feels like it's a strong Space Marine rule that got stronger. I feel like going back to a bit more like the index version of the rule might do some weird things for Space Marine matchups once again though. Things like Custodians and Knights and slow moving melee monsters and things that need to sit in the open. They're all just going to be far more easily killed for Space Marine lists, with things like Redemptor Dreadnoughts and Predator Destructors and Hellblasters being able to pretty happily gun down whatever's in their sights. For anything that's trying to stat check you with the amount of durability that it has, Oath of Moment does feel like it's just going to allow you to overpower that unit that a lot of other armies might just not be able to kill. On the other hand, it's going to be far less good against armies that'll try and hide and only expose expendable units and rely on alpha strikes. If you're generally going to have things that jump into the fray, shoot up the Space Marines and then expect to die in return, Oath of Moment with +1 to wound probably isn't going to help so much against them. It might matter more about the Space Marine speed and durability as opposed to the damage output, which they've probably already got enough of. As with current Oath of Moment, but more pronounced, it's also going to be unusually impactful in smaller games. Say if you're playing 1,000 points, then each time you declare Oath of Moment, it's going to be marking really quite a major chunk of the enemy army. And you could argue it's having something to the tune of twice the power as it would in a 2,000 point game. As with twice the amount of units on the board, you don't get twice the Oath of Moment. It certainly feels like it doesn't really scale quite so well as some of the other rules like it in 40k. In any case, it definitely seems interesting. It is really nice to see one solid advantage to playing core codex chapters that isn't a Divergent one. And for most lists that are actually using the Divergent chapter units, it's either a choice of more unit and detachment access versus a solidly powerful damage increase on the one unit that you're focusing, plus whatever the core codex characters can actually do for their armies. As mentioned, Guilliman seems immense and probably outcompetes the rest, though at least Games Workshop did throw a bone to the other Divergent chapters in allowing them to boost the OC of certain units. It feels like Cave on Strike with jump intercessors could be quite a nice one as a fast-moving skirmish unit. It does still feel that out of the core codex chapters though, it's probably going to be Ultramarines and then everyone else. Guilliman just seems absolutely immense. Marlies Calgar and Uriel Ventris both got solid nerfs in points to the point where they're more usable than super standout, I'd say. But they're still both good datasheets, and I wonder if a few more people might be tempted by Tigurius now. He's always had quite a bit of datasheet strength, but maybe felt a bit overshadowed. His own psychic damage works rather well with Oath at the moment, and I guess he could have a lot of interest for Librarius Conclave if people want to use that. In any case, will certainly be interesting to see what it does to tournament stats. Standard Space Marines seem to have been kept kind of artificially low for quite a good time recently. But apart from Ultramarines being scary, I still think it's kind of nice that you could have armies like Imperial Fist and White Scars have one big advantage in the boosted Oath over some of their Divergent chapters with so much more unit and detachment access, so perhaps feels like a touch more of a levelling of the playing field there. In any case, look forward to hearing your takes on New Oath at the moment. How impactful has it been in games since the Data Slate update, and are your Space Marines doing better because of it? As mentioned, feel free to check out the video sponsor linked down in the video description. Warhaus in Australia is a new gaming store and has a big discount on Games Workshop products. I'll leave a link to their website and their Instagram down in the video description. Otherwise, if you enjoyed the videos, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description below. Channel patrons get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.